I stood perfectly still in my Air Force service dress, a statue of blue wool in the sterile, bustling environment of the international airport's VIP arrivals section. My uncle Raj, a loud and self-important businessman who mistook his own volume for authority, clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. His voice boomed, deliberately pitched for the nearby travelers to hear. "See? Told you she just wears it for show. A pretty decoration to impress the tourists." He let out a deep, rolling laugh, genuinely pleased with his own wit. My face remained a mask of professional calm, a skill honed over years of practice. Then a sleek motorcade glided to a stop just outside the glass doors. A distinguished man, the German diplomatic envoy, emerged, flanked by a silent, imposing security detail. He moved with an unnerving purpose, his eyes scanning the area before walking directly past my uncle and my father without a flicker of acknowledgement. He stopped squarely in front of me. He didn't offer a hand, he offered a short, respectful bow of his head. "Colonel Sharma," the envoy said, his voice crisp and clear, cutting through the terminal noise like a scalpel. "Your command has secured the terminal. The asset is ready for transport on your order." 2 hours earlier, the air was thick with a more familiar kind of tension. My father, Arun, a retired Navy captain who believed the only real military branch was the one that floated, was deep into his favorite lecture about my stagnant Air Force career. To him, my life's work in intelligence and logistics was a glorified administrative role, a complete waste of our family's warrior legacy. My uncle Raj, his civilian mouthpiece, was happy to amplify the disdain, always ready to mock my desk job. They all believed I was simply there to see a cousin off, that I'd just come straight from my base and couldn't be bothered to change. The moment the ice in my veins truly began to harden, the real catalyst, came when Raj spotted a family friend. He gestured to me with a dismissive wave. "Anya's job is mostly paperwork and parades," he announced loudly, directly, in front of my second-in-command, Command Sergeant Major Miller. "She's just a decoration in uniform." I saw it all in a flash. CSM Miller's jaw tightened, a flicker of pure professional outrage in his eyes before his discipline took over and his expression went neutral. He was following my lead, of course, and remained silent. But this wasn't just another dismissive comment at a family dinner. This was a public undermining of my authority in front of a senior NCO. It was an insult that compromised the very chain of command I relied on. My uncle's laughter echoed in the terminal. He thought he was just landing another cheap joke. He had no idea he'd just questioned my command in front of the man who runs my entire non-commissioned officer corps. To understand the protocol-driven reckoning that was about to unfold, you have to understand the two wars I was fighting. One in the shadows of global intelligence, and the other in the glaring light of my own family's disappointment. To my family, my life was a story they had already written, and I was just a minor character. This narrative was never clearer than at our Sunday dinners. My father, Arun, would hold court from the head of the table, his voice echoing, with the authority of a man who had once commanded a naval destroyer. The centerpiece of our dining room wasn't a vase of flowers, it was a large, framed photograph of him on the bridge of his ship, the sea churning behind him. That picture was his entire argument for what a meaningful life in the service looked like. It was his proof, and I was his disappointment. Just last month, I had received a commendation medal for orchestrating the single largest logistical movement of medical supplies into a disaster zone in over a decade. When I showed it to him, he held the medal in his palm for a moment, his thumb rubbing over the inscription. Then he handed it back with a thin smile. "Logistical excellence," he read aloud, his tone laced with a faint, almost pitying amusement. "Well, it's good they recognize the effort. A nice little participation trophy for you, Anya." A participation trophy. I felt the familiar cold knot tighten in my stomach. It was the same knot I felt when he'd dismissed my acceptance into the Air Force Academy as a good backup plan. The same one that appeared when he'd called my master's degree in strategic intelligence a fine hobby. Over the years, that knot had become a permanent part of me. To him and the rest of the family, especially my cousins in combat arms roles, I was the Chair Force Colonel. It was a joke they all loved, a nickname that neatly summed up their perception of my career. My work was strategic, cerebral, and often secret, and to them, that meant it was soft. It was feminine. It wasn't real. They couldn't understand that a war could be won with a single piece of intel, or a perfectly executed supply chain. They only understood the symbols they could see, the ship, the tank, the rifle. My battlefield was a series of secure servers and encrypted satellite feeds, a world they refused to even try to imagine. My real world was a universe away from those loud, dismissive family dinners. It existed in the dead quiet, freezing cold hum of a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility, at Andrews Air Force Base. There, I wasn't the Chair Force Colonel. I was the lead planner for Operation Steel Compass, a multi-agency operation, so sensitive that its failure could destabilize an entire region. My name wasn't a punchline, it was the final word on every critical decision. I remember the pre-mission briefing vividly. The room was dark, illuminated only by the cool blue glow of a massive tactical screen displaying a satellite map of the airport. On a secure video conference call were my counterparts from the CIA, the State Department, and my commanding officer. I stood at the head of the table, pointing to a specific sector of the tarmac. "General," I began, my voice steady and measured, "the threat matrix shows a 90-minute window of vulnerability during the tarmac handoff. My team will have a C-STARS unit on standby and will run a full electronic counter to surveillance sweep 30 minutes prior. We are treating this as a contested environment." There was no debate, no second guessing, only quiet, professional trust. On the screen was General Madsen, a stern but fair Joint Chiefs liaison who had personally chosen me to run this operation. He was a man who didn't care about family legacy or what branch of the service you were in. He cared about competence. He listened to my full breakdown of the operation, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he simply nodded. "The success of this mission rests on you, Colonel," he said, his voice gravelly but clear. "I have full confidence." He cut the feed, and the screen went dark, leaving me in the silent, blue-lit room. In that moment, the weight of the world was on my shoulders, but it was a good weight. It was the weight of responsibility, of trust earned through years of silent, thankless work. It was a weight my father could never comprehend. He measured a person's worth by the noise they made, and my greatest achievements were always wrapped in silence. That quiet respect was the air I breathed in my professional life. It was embodied by men like my Command Sergeant Major Miller, a seasoned veteran, who had served in more combat zones than my father had ever seen on a map. Before we left for the airport, as I was doing a final check of my uniform, he approached me. He knew my family was going to be there, and he knew what they were like. He stood before me, his posture perfect, his eyes holding a depth of understanding that my own family lacked. He didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. He just gave me a short, sharp nod. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady. "The team is prepped and on your mark. Ignore the noise." He paused for a beat, his gaze unwavering. "They know who's in charge." And that was it. In that simple statement, he confirmed everything. My authority wasn't a decoration. It was real. It was earned, and it was respected by the only people who truly mattered, the team whose lives depended on it. For a decade, I had tried to translate my world for them. I tried to explain that the modern battlefield is fought with logistics and intelligence, not just cannons, but they only respected the symbols of power they understood. So, standing there in that airport, I decided to stop translating. It was time for a practical demonstration. As my uncle's laughter bounced off the polished airport floors, something inside me shifted. The familiar sting of humiliation was there, but it was quickly being replaced by something else, a cold, sharp clarity. This was no longer just about me, or about their endless, petty dismissals. My uncle had questioned my command in front of my most senior non-commissioned officer. He had turned my family's personal dysfunction into a professional liability. And that was a line I would not allow to be crossed. I turned and walked away from them without a word, my footsteps measured and even. I wasn't retreating in anger. I was moving to a better tactical position. I found a quiet corner overlooking the tarmac, the noise of the terminal fading into a dull hum as my training took over. My goal wasn't revenge. It was mission security. The public revelation of my authority would simply be a necessary byproduct. My world operates on a foundation of protocol. It's a rigid, absolute language of procedure and hierarchy that leaves no room for interpretation. To me, it's clarity. To my family, it was an invisible wall they were about to run into at full speed. Their presence, their ignorance, their sheer volume, they had become an unsecured variable in a highly sensitive diplomatic transfer. I could no longer treat them as family. I had to treat them as a potential complication to be managed. I pulled out my secure communications device, the encrypted signal connecting instantly. I wasn't Anya, the disappointing daughter, anymore. I was the officer in command. "This is Athena," I said, my voice calm and devoid of emotion, using my operational call sign. "We have an unsecured civilian element in the arrival zone. I need you to proceed with Protocol 7. Formal address on approach. The envoy will make direct contact with me, and only me, upon arrival." "Acknowledge." There was a clipped response of confirmation. The trap wasn't emotional, it was procedural. It was a real-world contingency for establishing a clear chain of command, in a fluid, public environment, and I had just activated it. With the first piece in place, I set the second. I switched to my command channel, the one connecting me to my team on the ground. "Sergeant Major," I said, my voice as crisp as the winter air. "Position yourself near the civilian element. When the envoy makes contact with me, I need you to render a full salute. Make it sharp." CSM Miller understood immediately. He didn't need an explanation, he only needed the order. A salute from a command sergeant major, especially one as respected as Miller, is not a simple greeting. It is a public and undeniable affirmation of rank and authority. It's a gesture my father, the retired Navy captain, would understand. Instantly, viscerally, in a way no argument or explanation ever could. It was the perfect, non-verbal exclamation point. My father and uncle thought they were in a family drama. They had no idea they were now unsecured elements in a federal security operation. The rules of engagement had changed, and I was the one writing them. I returned to my position near the main doors, a calm island in the sea of my family's oblivious chatter. They had arranged themselves on the plush seats in the VIP arrivals hall at Dulles, acting as though they owned the place. They still believed they were there for a minor family event, that they had front-row seats to a little show, courtesy of my connections. My Uncle Raj was in his element, holding court with another traveler, a man in an expensive suit who looked vaguely impressed. He gestured toward me with his chin, a smug, proprietary smile on his face. "That's my niece," he announced, his voice carrying. "She's in the Air Force, likes to wear the uniform everywhere." He chuckled, and the man nodded politely. I watched this little performance, feeling nothing but a profound sense of distance. It was like watching a scene from a play where I was merely a prop, waiting for my cue. They had no idea the curtain was about to rise on a production entirely of my own design. Then everything changed. A silent signal, invisible to the civilians in the room, rippled through the terminal. The doors slid open, and the envoy's party entered. The atmosphere in the hall shifted instantly, the ambient hum of conversation dropping by half. Quiet, professional men in perfectly tailored suits moved in first, their eyes constantly scanning, their presence a subtle but unyielding wall of security. Travelers instinctively lowered their voices, their casual gaits slowing as they sensed a shift in power. The envoy himself followed, a man who carried the full authority of his government in his steady, purposeful walk. He wasn't just a VIP. He was a symbol of state, and the entire environment reoriented itself around him. My family, for the first time, fell silent. My uncle's story died on his lips. They were finally seeing a glimpse of a world that did not revolve around them. The envoy's path was a straight, unwavering line. He moved through the crowd, his gaze fixed forward. I saw my father, Arun, straighten his posture slightly, a subconscious reflex in the presence of power. He and my uncle were directly in the envoy's path, expecting, I'm sure, at least a nod of acknowledgement. They received nothing. The envoy walked past them as if they were statues, his eyes never wavering until they locked onto mine. He stopped precisely 3 feet in front of me, the exact distance dictated by diplomatic protocol. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. The scattered conversations around us faded into a dull, distant roar. Several travelers, sensing the focused energy of the moment, stopped to watch. The envoy spoke, his voice not loud, but carrying an authority that demanded attention. "Colonel Sharma," he said, the 2 words landing with the force of a gavel. "Your command has secured the terminal. The asset is ready for transport on your order." Simultaneously, another sound cut through the air. It was the sharp, resonant report of CSM Miller's hand snapping to the brow of his cover in a perfect, rigid salute. "Ma'am?" His voice wasn't a shout, but a clean, powerful bark of respect that echoed in the sudden silence. It was the confirmation, the exclamation point, the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. I watched my Uncle Raj's smug smile dissolve, his jaw going slack as his brain struggled to process the scene. His eyes darted from the distinguished foreign diplomat to me, then back to the ramrod. Straight Sergeant Major, the gears of his simple worldview grinding to a halt. He was utterly, hopelessly lost. But the true climax, the moment I had unknowingly waited for my entire life, was my father's reaction. As a retired officer, he understood every single signal perfectly. The formal address. From a foreign official, the term, "your command," the Sergeant Major's salute. It was an undeniable public display of a chain of command in which his daughter, not him, was at the very top. His posture changed instantly. His back went ramrod straight, his shoulders squared in a conditioned military reflex he hadn't displayed in years. And on his face, beneath the shock, was a flicker of dawning horror. He was looking at me, but he wasn't seeing his daughter anymore. He was seeing a field-grade commanding officer. He was seeing the truth. My uncle saw a diplomat. My father saw the truth. For years he had lectured me on the meaning of command. In the space of 10 seconds, a German envoy and an American sergeant major taught him that I had already learned it. I gave the German envoy a curt, professional nod, a silent acknowledgement that his part in this small drama was over. "Proceed when ready, sir." My attention then shifted to the man who had always been my rock. "Miller," I said, my voice steady. "Let's get to work." I turned my back on my family, on the frozen, gaping faces of my uncle and father, and I walked away. I did not look back. I did not need to. As I moved through the terminal, my radio already in hand to coordinate the next phase of the transport, I could feel the eyes of other travelers on me. Their expressions were no longer ones of idle curiosity. They were looks of respect, of awe, of people who had just witnessed something they didn't fully understand but recognized as significant. My family remained behind, a small, isolated island of stunned silence in the bustling crowd, suddenly irrelevant. They were a problem that had been solved, a variable that had been neutralized. 6 months later, the sterile chill of the Dulles airport felt like a lifetime away. I was standing in the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, a city that understood a thing or two about walls coming down. I was no longer in my formal service dress, but in my operational uniform, the functional fabric a second skin. I had been promoted. I was now the lead military liaison for all diplomatic security operations. In Central Europe, a position of immense trust and responsibility. In front of me, seated around a polished mahogany table in a secure briefing room, was my new team, a joint force of American and German intelligence officers. Seasoned professionals who looked at me with expressions of focused attention. Here, my authority isn't a shocking revelation, it was the baseline assumption. It was the entire reason we were in the room. This was my new family, a tribe forged not by blood or obligation, but by mutual respect and a shared, critical purpose. The validation wasn't loud or dramatic, it was the quiet, steady hum of competence in a room, full of experts, and it was more fulfilling than any family praise I had ever chased. One evening, I was working late in my office overlooking the Tiergarten, reviewing after-action reports from a recent operation. The city lights twinkled below, a sea of quiet brilliance. A small notification popped up on my screen, an email from a sender I hadn't seen in half a year. It was from my father, Arun. The subject line was what struck me first. It didn't say from Dad. It said, from Captain Sharma. It was a formal address, a concession of rank from his world to mine. My hand hesitated over the mouse for a long moment before I clicked it open. The email was short, clipped, and devoid of any real warmth. It was the closest a man like him could ever come to an apology. Anya, it read. I was incorrect in my assessment of your career. Your service does our family name credit. I would like to discuss it. I read the words over and over. This was it. The acknowledgement I had once thought I would do anything to receive. The validation I had spent decades craving. And I felt nothing. There was no surge of triumph, no satisfying rush of victory. There was only a quiet, sad resolution. A chapter closing so long after the story had already moved on. His approval, the thing that had once been the sun my entire world orbited around, was now just a distant, cold star. My peace was no longer contingent on his verdict. I had found my own worth in the quiet confidence of my team and the successful execution of my missions. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the warmth spreading through my chest. Then, with a single deliberate click, I moved his email to the archive folder. It wasn't an act of anger or revenge, it was an act of simple organization. I was filing away a piece of correspondence that was no longer relevant. I turned my chair back to the massive glowing monitor on my wall, my eyes tracing the complex web of a mission map. That was my legacy. That was my name. My father thought legacy was a name you pass down. I learned that a true legacy is the name you earn, the one spoken with respect in rooms where history is made. If you've ever had to build your own legacy in the face of doubt, tell us in the comments. This is a community that understands the mission.